Welcome to Acid Horizon, the theory podcast presented in collaboration with Repeater Books and Zer0 Media. And today, folks, I am just absolutely thrilled to be joined by the legendary Franco Berardi, otherwise known, of course, as Bifo, known, of course, from everything from Radio Alice to the foundations of A Traverso, all the way through an extensive book catalogue, including Uprisings, Heroes, The Second Coming, and now out in August, Quit Everything, Interpreting Depression. I'm, of course, joined by our resident autonomous expert, one Mr. Kenneth Novis, and I just want to welcome Franco to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this dialogue, to this interview. As I already said, my listening comprehension is a little bit problematic, so please forgive me for my. Sometimes I give wonderful answers to the wrong questions, or anyway, I will do my possible.
It's okay. We will be applying Deleuze-Guattarian difference to any questions we go through today. And so today, I want to start off by talking about the current state of capitalism, of what you call semio-capitalism, which is increasingly cognitive, immaterial. It relies upon shoving as many people as possible through these various machines, be it social media, be it mass surveillance. And one of the sort of the real powers of your work, I think, is the way in which you describe the ways in which our cognition, our affect, our very energies of attention are filtered through these machines and how they end up changing us. And so the question I want to ask is, how do you see the current frontiers of semio-capitalism, of cognitive capitalism, and why is it you think that they're causing, if anything, let's say a plague of depression and deflation in the contemporary consciousness, in the contemporary psyche?
Well, as you said, semio-capitalism is another way to say cognitive capitalism. It's not exactly the same, because when you say cognitive capitalism, you are stressing the force of cognitive labor which is invested in the contemporary process of production. When you say semio-capitalism, you stress the product of this activity, the semiological stuff, the semiological matter, if I can say, immaterial matter, if you want, that is produced, exchanged, and consumed. The point is that the semio activity, both productive and the activity of consumption, is not only implying a physical, muscular energy. It is also and mainly implying the investment of mental energy. And when I say mental, I do not refer only to the activity of understanding, of elaborating symbols and so on, but I also refer to the emotional implications of this kind of activity. So, inside the semio-capitalist dimension, many things change, not only at the economic level, but mainly at the level of subjectivity, production of subjectivity, investment of subjectivity, exhaustion of subjectivity. The crucial effect of the semio-capitalist transformation is an effect of exhaustion of our mental energies. This exhaustion happens at many levels that provoke all a range of, let's say, of pathology, of pathologies. The first, I have tried in the last years to define the main forms of these pathological exhaustion of mental energy, and I have decided to name two essential processes of pathologization. The first is panic. Panic is, in my opinion, the exposure of the mind to an excessive amount of nervous stimulation. And when I say nervous stimulation, I mean info, but also cerebral, physical stimulation. One, panic. Second, in a condition of panic, the human mind tends at a certain point to break the relation with the sources of information. And this is opening the way to what I call depression. Depression being the rupture, the breakdown of the desire of being in contact with reality and with the infosphere. So this is, let's say, a sort of description of the process that leads to the so-called depression. Nevertheless, I don't want to stop to this description because the description is good for psychiatrists. I am not a psychiatrist, so I want to understand better what is beyond the immediate perception of depression. This is the subtitle, as you say, the subtitle of this book is Interpreting Depression.
And
not describing depression.
That really interests me, just the focus on interpretation, because of course, on the channel we're so in the legacy of Mark Fisher, who was precisely politicizing his depression. But one of the things one of the strengths I think of this book is the returning to some of the psychiatric, or let's say Freudo-Marxist, or let's say less rigid psychiatric resources you draw upon here. One of my so for example, fans of the show will be quite surprised at this because he doesn't show up much. James Hillman has quite a strong appearance in this book, as well as Wilhelm Reich and his theory of character armoring, and so it really is refreshing to see that again in the work. And I just wanted to ask a question, just a follow-up on the nature of pathology here, because there's a history of using various terms, for example, the way that Deleuze and Guattari use schizophrenia. Could you clarify how you're using terms, for example, like autism in this context as well? Because I know there's quite a lot of the discussions of normativity and autism understood in a behavioral, or at least a sociological sense in this book. And I was wondering if you could sort of clarify sort of what the referent is. Is it a reference in terms of framing abnormality against normality, or is it historicizing and criticizing those kind of diagnostic norms themselves?
So you have quoted Mark Fisher, then Marx and Freud, then you come to Deleuze and Guattari. I like this succession because if you start with the works of Mark Fisher, actually you find a sort of problematization of Marxism from the point of view of psychoanalysis and of psychoanalysis from the point of view of Marxism. My thesis is that we have been going through two different moments of the psychoanalytic reflection on the social pathology. The first one can be identified in many texts of Freud, but particularly in Civilization and its Discontents. A text of the year 1927 that is the definition of a clear point of view of psychoanalysis on the evolution of society and civilization at large. Freud says that we have to discount, to accept the idea that civilization implies a certain degree of repression, of repression of desire, of then we have actually Freud is describing very well the bourgeois perception of civilization. And from that point of view, no problem, it's perfect, but the bourgeois definition of society is not everything, and society is something more complicated and rich. So at a certain point, in the 60s and in the 70s, desire comes back on the stage, and desire comes back with the intention of changing the terms of the very process of civilization. Think to authors like Herbert Marcuse, Erich Fromm, and at the end, of course, Deleuze and Guattari. What is the essential transformation in the psychoanalytic or schizoanalytic point of view of Guattari? That all of a sudden, the core of the problem is no more normality of civilization, but the margins of what is, in a sense, outside, in the fringes of the process of evolution of society. From this point of view, which is the point of view that Michel Foucault has very well defined in his book about the history of folly, of madness, the history of the segregation of psychological suffering. And Guattari tries to subvert this relation. And he says schizophrenia is not to be seen as only as a pathology, it has also to be seen as a force of production of new and new and new and new and new and new, and new, infinite new possibility of imagination. This kind of reversal of a perspective has been very useful for understanding some social processes that happened in the decades of the movement, not only of the movement, also in the years of the media transformation, the years of experimentation of a new concatenation of the media that leads at the end to the growth, to explosion of the internet. The concept of network is crucial in the schizoanalytic point of view of Guattari. He says no more different plans, but levels, plateaux that are continuously intersecting acting in a rhizomatic way. This is a good explanation of what happened, but in the long run, today, we are obliged to see the dark side of this schizoanalytic point of view. I mean, we have to recognize that the other side of the free radio in Italy have been Berlusconi and the commercial TV. The other side of the multiplication of points of view has been the end of the critical thought and the multiplication of fake news and so on and so on. I mean, the acceleration produced by the multiplication of the points of view has provoked a dark effect that has as a consequence also panic and depression that we are talking about before. So I have tried to speak of a third dimension of the unconscious. Obviously, the unconscious is not historical, in the sense that you cannot write a history of the unconscious. The unconscious is simultaneously infinite and punctual. It's not possible to find a before and an after. The unconscious does not know time, so there is not before and after. So when I say the third unconscious, actually, I'm speaking of a third psychosphere, a new dimension of the media and an accelerated dimension of the media that has produced a new psychological sphere in which we live a condition that can be defined psychopathologically panic and depression. But here we are. What is the way out of this situation? This is the problem that I ask in Quit Everything.
Kenny, I know you had a question in this direction in terms of strategy, so please go for it.
Yeah. So first of all, I'm extremely thrilled to have this chance to speak with you, as Adam said in his introduction.
It's a pleasure for me, Kenneth.
Thank you. As Adam said in his introduction, a lot of my work these days is on like operaismo and post-operaismo and kind of discussions around autonomism. And you've said a lot there, which would be fascinating to kind of parse through more carefully. But maybe it would be good just in the first place, and I ask this because of my interest in Italian political philosophy, if we could hear something about how your own philosophy, how your own ideas sit in relation to what Roberto Esposito called the living thought of Italian theory. You know, as I was reading your book, something that stood out to me in particular is this relation that it seems like it should have to all of these theories of subjectivation and desubjectivation, of constituent and destituent power that you might see, for example, in Paolo Virno, especially with, say, the emphasis that he puts on Simone Weil and the demand in our political moment for processes of desubjectivation, or even, as Simone Weil would have it, seeking out those things that cause an exhaustion, a depression of the subjectivity.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I read the book of Roberto Esposito, Il pensiero vivente, Living Thought. And I found this book, I'm not especially a reader of Esposito. I read some of his books, Immunitas, but this book is very important, in my opinion, because Esposito, is dying something concerning the notion of subjectivation. And he says that subjectivation is obviously about the genesis of the subject, but something is lost in the concept of the subject. What is lost? The body. Quite simply, the bodily dimension, the physical dimension. As we know, subject is a concept that comes from Hegel. Hegel is the thinker that posits the problem of the evolution of the subject as the evolution of the truth. The subject in his evolution is the deployment of the truth. Well, we cannot deny that the dialectical materialism of Marx and also of the Marxist tradition is very much involved in that kind of idea that is reducing history to the self-development of the spirit, of the Geist, of the subject. Guattari has done an important correction when he says that there is no subject, there is subjectivation, which means that the important is not the internal spiritual history of the subject. The important is the social, interactive, pragmatic dimension of the becoming subject. But Esposito makes steps beyond. Esposito says, if we really want to understand what is the meaning of subjectivation, especially in the political and philosophical tradition of Italy, we have to speak of the body. And his references, especially in history of art, especially La Battaglia di Angeri, the reference that Esposito does to this work of Leonardo da Vinci, in which what is important is, yes, history, but history is the heaviness of the bodies of horses, of warriors, of armors, of suffering, of aggression. You feel the presence of a body. Well, this, how can I say, corporality, this bodily presence is a good explanation of the Italian specificity in the field of philosophy and also in the field of politics. When I say these words, I see the ambiguousness of this point. I see that the body is not a good guy, not always. Many times the body is an enemy of the body itself, the fascist body. So when we say the body, we refer to the Baroque tradition in the Italian art, in the Italian thought, and in the Italian politics. I think that Marxism in general has not considered in the right way this problem of Baroque. What is Baroque? That is the point. A fascist, in my opinion, fascism, Italian fascism, is consciously the coming back of Baroque in the modern politics. Baroque has the primacy of the spectacle, and Mussolini is the force of Mussolini, the political force of Mussolini, is all about the powerful entering of the body in the political history. Berlusconi is the same. I mean, from Mussolini to Berlusconi, you can see the continuity of this ambiguous presence of the masculine body and the ambiguous subjection of the feminine body. A fascist writer called Malaparte, Turzio Malaparte, the author of novels like The Skin or Caput. Malaparte was a fantastic writer, in my opinion, a fascist, and a very disgusting person, morally speaking. But I cannot read his books without a sort of literary emotion. And at a certain point, in a small book published in the year 1925, Malaparte writes the following words: fascism is the coming back of Baroque in the history of Europe. And he says also, we refuse the idea that the history of civilization is the history of Protestant northern rigidity, and we reclaim the bodily presence of Baroque. You know, Italian fascism is conscious, Malaparte certainly is conscious, that the main contribution of the Italian theater to the modern politics is essentially the invasivity of the body, the presence of the body that is. I want to ask me a question. I ask myself, what now? Where is now the Italian body? This is an open question. Because, you know, I don't feel so Italian, frankly speaking, from any point of view. I don't feel neither European. I don't believe in national identity at all, but I see that there is something interesting in the Italian experience. And this interesting contribution of Italy has been generally to be the laboratory of power. In Italy, we have experimented with a certain anticipation the transformation of power. Berlusconi has anticipated Donald Trump 20 years before.
So again, you say a lot of extremely interesting things there. But I'd like to just pick up on, as a follow-up question, if I can, what you say about Europe, because I think that can bring us right back to the subject of the book itself. When you said that, I hope you'll forgive me, but I couldn't help but think of that really admirable letter that you sent to Yanis Varoufakis about DIEM 25. And that to me seems like a kind of praxis of the form that you seem to be recommending in this book. That is a strategy of desertion. We are not, as you kind of say in that letter, we refuse to be European because we know what it means to have been European. Would you say that that's an illustration of kind of the strategy of desertion?
Yeah, let me give you two different answers because you open two different problematics. The first is about Europe. Actually, yes, at a certain point, at the beginning of this century, many of my friends and comrades, like Tony Negri, for instance, decided to be Europeans. They had the perception that after the defeat of the workers' movement, the only possibility of defending something of democracy was to accept the European challenge, the European. And Varoufakis, at a certain point, emerged as a sort of hero of the European opposition to neoliberalism and the resurgence of fascism. So in the year 2015, during the Greek summer of the referendum, when the Greek voters went to decide about their future and decided no, but at the end have been obliged to bend and accept the blackmail. In that moment, I felt very sympathetic with Varoufakis. And I accepted to take part in the Congress of Foundation of DiEM25. I was not so persuaded of the possibility of creating a real democracy in Europe in the year 2025, but why not? So I took part in that Congress and I took part in the activities of DiEM for 1 year or so. Then, when the wave of migrants coming from Africa and the Middle East were rejected in a racist, violent way, when I discovered that 30,000 people have been drowned in the Mediterranean Sea in the first 15 years of the century. In the last 10 years, probably they are much more many than so. Anyway, when I discovered that Europe is based on the rejection, I wrote a letter to Varoufakis saying, I'm sorry, I like you very much. And I still repeat that I like very much what Varoufakis is doing. His speech in Berlin 2 weeks ago is a proof of his political ability and integrity. But I am sorry, I am your friend, I support you, but I am not an European. I'm sorry to tell you that I am ashamed of this identity. Because, in the year 1933, a philosopher called Julian Benda wrote in Discours à la Nation européenne, said, Europe will be built not on what we are, but on what we think and want. Well, more interesting words, but it's fake. It's impossible. Europeans are not thinkers. Europeans are racists. This is the reality of the large majority of the Europeans. Europeans defend their privilege against the majority of the humankind. That is the point. And this is the first answer. Then I want to say something about the second question, which is about desertion. Yes, we have presented here a book that is titled quit everything. The Italian title is Disertate. Difficult to translate in English because the translation would be desert, but it's ambiguous. Desert is the substantive referring to a land without human beings. Well, interesting, desert. But no, I mean the verb referring to those people who abandon the delusions of modernity. I started writing that book at the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war. I think that this war is the proof that fascism is back everywhere in Europe. It's the proof that all the promises that have been subscribed after 1945, all those promises are fake, false, hypocrites, and denied by the reality of a nationalist war that is opposing fascism against fascism. I don't support the Russian invasion. I don't support the Western aggressiveness and the Western decision to oblige thousands and thousands of young Ukrainians to die for our corrupt ideals of nationalism. So at that moment, I thought that the only possible choice was the choice of those Russians and of those Ukrainians who go away, who desert, defect, abandon, refuse, quit. And I discovered that this attitude, this position is not only referred to war, is also referred to all the kinds of conditions unacceptable in which we are obliged to live. Desertion is, in my opinion, the possible positive evolution of what today is called depression. No more depression, desertion.
I just want to follow up on that. I mean, but I do actually want to take this thread of desertion a bit further, because in almost a tragic historical way, that's, you know, this book signs off in 2022, and things are in a way so much worse today in terms of new fronts. And you know, this book is very much about ethics. You know, it particularly, I noticed you draw a lot on Deleuze's reading of Hume and the nature of sympathy as a way of establishing new connections between those who want to desert, between the exhausted of the earth, to use a repeat of books, another title we have. How do you think, insofar as we're talking about an ethics here that ties into a politics of refusing complicity with a fascist world, so how would we apply this sort of framework? Do you think this framework of desertion, depression has become accelerated by the various networks in which we're complicit with the current situation in Palestine? Of course, the echoes of '68 happening across the universities. They're trying to highlight this.
You know, I am following, of course, what is happening in the American universities, not only in the American, because in the French, in the Dutch universities, something similar is happening. Yesterday, I gave a talk here at the University of Bologna, at the academy, actually, proposing the occupation of the university area. And I think that something is happening also here. But beyond the horror that every single person is experiencing when we are obliged to witness a genocide every day in our screens, beyond this horror, beyond the solidarity that we express to the Palestinian people, beyond this, it is a problem of identification. I mean, when we say free Palestine, and millions of people are saying free Palestine, but what do we mean? Are we referring to Palestine as a brilliant future, as the possibility of a liberation? Do we expect that from this horrible situation, a new socialist or humanist state of Palestine? No. We do not identify with Hamas, of course. We do not, for me, I speak for myself, but I think that the majority of the students worldwide are not identifying with Hezbollah, are not identifying with Islamists. So what is our sympathy? And my answer is despair. The perception, the sympathetic perception that we have, that we all have, I think, when we see what is happening in Palestine, is that we feel that their future has been destroyed like our future has been destroyed. So we feel a togetherness, a similarity, not in the brilliant future, but in the destruction of future. So the only way is not an assertive way, like in the 60s, in the years of the Vietnam War. One could say Viet Cong is the future. Nobody can expect the future from Hamas. So what are we expecting? My answer is we expect the possibility of escaping from this condition of war, of expanding fascism, of expanding hatred.
Franco, all I have to say is thank you so much for joining us.
It has been a pleasure, and I am sorry I cannot go on more. I would like to speak for hours with you, but I have a problem of voice in the last years. I cannot more
problem. I mean, you just did a lecture before this. No, it's brilliant to see you trooping on at this. It's brilliant to have you here. Don't worry. We'll get as many links up to Quit Everything in terms of pre-orders down below, in terms of formal housekeeping, and I just want to thank everyone for listening as well.
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zer0 Books today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zer0 has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.